This is a topic that is both fascinating and slightly complicated to talk about, mainly because of the state of flux surrounding the issue of data, in particular data as it relates to mobility as a service, but as well as the interaction between new mobility as a service providers and those that are already present on the ground and have been for quite a long time, the public transport providers, which is again one of the focus or the main focus of these past three sessions. If there's one thing we can thank mobility as a service or the discussion around mobility as a service for, it's the profusion of puns that now become available. So I'm going to talk about what must we think about, what must we consider when we think about the mobility as a service, data, and platform governance. And I'll speak to four specific issues. One are a few words on data itself and its heterogeneity. Another will be related to the link between data and value for different actors in the mobility as a service chain. And this is important as well from a governance perspective. Of course, the issue of data sharing and governance. And finally, a few closing words on data syntax. And I'll wrap it up with some considerations of what is currently under consideration in Europe, which right now, at least in terms of an overarching data governance framework, is the one region that is taking the lead in this area. So if we look around our cities, we can see that there are, of course, a lot of moving objects, and some of those moving objects provide a lot more data than others. Here you have those mobility services. What you don't see, of course, here is the metro running underneath the street that produces a lot of data as well in a very particular format. Buses produce data. Cars, although they occupy most of the mobility space, don't produce a lot of data, and this is an issue to consider going forward, that one of the most problematic aspects of mobility in cities is not smart up until recently, but rather dumb in terms of data production. So there is a bias on where data is available and who produces data that we have to keep in mind. But basically, this data links to a few central questions. Who is moving? What is moving? Where is it moving? When is it moving? How is it moving? Is it moving in scheduled service, unscheduled service? And finally, how much does it cost, or how much is the price that consumers are facing, and the fares that they may want to or may have to pay? There are, in addition to the traditional data sources that we've exploited for urban mobility governance and public transport governance in particular, a number of new data sources that have appeared that have a lot of value, but for which our data architecture, if you will, has not been adequate to address apps, operating system data, and new types of data, even data that isn't primary or secondary, but data dust, if you will, from different devices that can be exploited and are being exploited in some instances by different public authorities and commercial operators. So three things to keep in the back of our head, back of our mind when we think about mobility data. The first is that not all of that data is relevant from a privacy perspective, but some of that data is highly relevant from a privacy perspective, especially data that links to space-time trajectories, that is the movement of entities, people or the vehicles or the phones that they have through space and time. And that is because anonymizing that data isn't sufficient to reduce the re-identification risks. And so inherent with that type of data is a real risk for the erosion of privacy. There's an excellent series in the non-research side coming from the New York Times looking at this specific issue. There's a tremendous amount of research looking at the re-identification risks of mobility data and spatial data in particular. Some of this data, as we've discussed already, is commercially sensitive. Sharing data amongst operators would reveal sensitive details or sensitive characteristics of their operations, which may aid their competitors. And finally, a good portion of that data, especially as it relates to the virtual representation of a physical production cycle, so schedule data for a public transport operator, is brand sensitive. It is what that operator produces in physical terms translated into virtual terms. And so there's a real desire as we heard already, for those that produce that service to manage their relationship with that service and manage the relationship with the data that might otherwise be attributed or obfuscated to other brands and other competitors. So these are three things to keep in the back of our mind, because they keep coming back in the data governance questions and debates. Now, moving on to the value of data. Of course, data is valuable for a lot of parties in the mobility chain. I've identified four main ones. Here it is, of course, the end user, because they value the use of this data and the processing of this data to access services that they value. For the operators that are producing the mobility service to improve their own operations, but also, as I said, to build on their brand identity and find their space and grow their competitive advantage in a market that's becoming increasingly crowded. There are third-party aggregators. Now, these tend to be more recent. Some of them are of the kind that we have been discussing, mobility as a service aggregators, and they want to develop products that federate a number of different data or a number of different mobility services, leveraging their data. But there are also third-party non-mobility aggregators that wish to access this data in order to sell data insights or use data insights for other types of services, advertising and other co-branding opportunities. And finally, public authorities are extremely interested in this data because one thing that we can see, at least in the past 10 to 15 years, is that a lot of the relevant data necessary to understand the urban ecosystem has shifted from public authorities' production and monitoring of data to the private sector's production and producing of data. And so there's a real angst on the part of certain public authorities that they, without access to that data, cannot fulfill well their mandate for citizens. I'll touch on each of these in respect to, with regards rather to what we should consider when thinking about mobility data in the mobility as a service environment. So starting with people. The power of the user interface is really where it all boils down to in mobility as a service, because people consume mobility as a service through a little bit less than 30 square meters that they hold in their hand, or maybe a bit more if they're interacting with a computer screen or a variable messaging screen or a variable messaging system that they might find in the metro or in other areas. But really, that's not a lot of real estate. And in these cases where requests are being answered and options are being offered, there is a real bias or real benefit to being among the first options introduced. And presentation bias is significant, and it's an issue that's been studied in a number of different screen-mediated or platform-mediated services. And it is present, of course, in this environment. I'm giving an example here on the left. This is the request for walking directions from the metro station closest to where you would have been to the OECD. And you can see that the first option returned by Google, which is not a mobility operator, but a data intermediary, is to take or to recommend taking a Lime scooter, so monetized the walking trip. Now, I'll pass on the fact that maybe a 5-minute scooter ride is very optimistic and a 9-minute walking time is very pessimistic, but there is a presentation bias here that we're seeing choices being offered. And behind that, there are market interactions and coordination and sometimes collusion that may come to play. Now, this isn't unique, as I said, to MaaS. There are other digitally mediated services. Airline computer reservation systems are one, and there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of research on those areas, and that is clearly one area where we should be looking to for some lessons, although there are differences between, of course, the mobility markets that we're talking about and those that were the focus of the airline computer reservation systems. But a main question here is, should the potential recourse to this issue be specific to mobility as a service, or should it be more generally applied to these kind of interactions, not just in the mobility sector? A quick word on application programming interfaces, because this is important to understand in understanding the different ways in which data can be delivered and how platform operates with this data. So basically, you have an application or a client, let's call it your phone, let's call it one operator, a public transport operator. They request information from another services data source service. And they use an API request, and there's a specific syntax to do that. The data source works on that request and returns a response that provides the answer to what the application was asking for. So it is both access and a syntax to a remote data service that is at the heart of the API and the very reason for APIs. Now, going back to the four, albeit very generalized governance or business models that was presented yesterday and that we proposed based on UITP's and EMTA's work a while back, I'll talk about what that means from the API perspective. So in the walled garden, and I'm making a difference here between a real walled garden and a small garden, and I think this came up yesterday in the discussion. In a real walled garden, these APIs are curated by the owner of that space, by the gardener, if you will. And they, in a real walled garden, are bespoke APIs. In a small garden, if you will, they could be open APIs. But there is an active curation of what is participating, what APIs and what services are participating in that environment. And in some ways, that leads to some market power for the curator. In the public transport authority integrating model, you have unidirectional APIs. So mobility services communicate with the public transport operators back end, but the return isn't necessarily the case. In the third case, regulated utility APIs, you have multi-directional APIs, where both the aggregators and the services on either side have open APIs communicating with a central data source, that remote data source being the platform. And finally, in the MaaS model, if you will, and sorry, Martin, I won't go into any more detail right now, but instead of APIs, you have smart contracts. And this is a way of handling the kind of tasks that APIs do, but adding on top of that the transaction conclusion element of a smart contract. Yves spoke 2 days ago of some of the issues that we have to think about in general governance and data governance, and I can only agree with many of the things that he said. The first, of course, that there are real efficiency outcomes that come from reducing transaction costs, and platforms do that. But the network effects are important, and this is true, of course, in two-sided, but increasingly multi-sided markets, where you have both mobility and non-mobility operators and services linking to clients via these platforms. And here, early and large players develop an advantage. Now, the contestability of those markets is untested under a number of emerging mobility regimes and mobility as a service regimes. And so while there's a dearth of research on how contestable these markets are under specific considerations or models that are being developed today, the contestability issue is not yet settled, I would say, and our thinking around that will probably evolve. Data sharing in these instances builds services, but bypasses traditional operators' self-distribution channels. And this goes back to what I said earlier about the schedule being the end of a production cycle that operators and public transport operators in particular want to protect. And going to Tom's point, I think here we can think of not just a technical solution to that, which is a smart contract as in the MaaS model, but trust contracts. These are normal contracts between players in the market, but with the application of competition rules and oversight. And one thing to consider in terms of fares, this is probably one of the most difficult parts of trying to understand how to build this into a platform architecture, the sharing of fare information. And one way around that, that already is in place in certain areas in Finland, for example, is to have a very basic obligation for a basic fare API. And then on the contractual side, you can build up joint fare APIs, subscription APIs, et cetera, built on open standards. Trust is, of course, at the heart of these questions. I'll turn to the issues that relate to public authority relationships and data sharing requests with operators. So this is not the platform side. This is in between public authorities and operators. And what we can see is, especially with new mobility operators, there is a central question of who do you trust? And if the answer is that these operators don't trust public authorities because of their capacity or because of their perceived, the new mobility operators' perceived weaknesses on the part of public authorities in handling their data, they would opt for processing the data on their own and providing aggregate data to the public authority. And the public authority would have to audit or have in place some kind of audit mechanism to find if that data is eventually authentic and the results of being transmitted are trustable. This is something that we have seen early on developing in trust relationships between public authorities and private operators. Now, if the public authority doesn't trust the operator, this is also a common case. We've seen it very recently in a number of cities in the US. The public authority requests all the data or a significant part of the raw data from the operator, and the public authority undergoes the data processing. And finally, if no one trusts anyone, and this is also a common situation, then there's recourse to a third party, a trusted third party. So the operator provides raw data to the trusted third party. That third party does the data processing, provides the aggregate data, the answer to the question that the public authority has to have in order to determine if their public action requirements are being met. And the public authority audits the data processing abilities and the trusted third party. So these are three different types of trust architectures. But I think one of the things from this is we can see that it all really comes back to what Martin was saying, is how well does the trust element in these relationships function. Trust is linked specifically to transparency on the purpose of the data collection, the use of the data, and in terms of the public and private data sharing relationship, data minimization principles. And here, going specifically to those instances where new mobility operators, because they are entering into trust architectures that have been built for public transport operators, entering into these type of relationships, rather than having a model where the public authority doesn't trust the operator and asks for all of the data with the privacy and commercially sensitive implications that implies, there's a bit of mapping that is possible and oftentimes is not undertaken. And that's linking the policy objective to a specific regulatory task, and then that itself being linked to a specific data ask in terms of aggregation level, in terms of latency, in terms of the very specific type of data that's being used for that regulatory task that carries out that policy objective. This is starting to happen as well. The important thing is to understand and to ensure that this type of mapping takes place across all players that are in the mobility as a service domain. Now, issues relating to data sharing, I'd like to touch on three things very quickly here. And one is that we have two models. One, which came up in Yves Closet's presentation on Monday, and it's not uncommon, it comes up in other thinking around this, is to have the public authority or a delegated responsible agency or entity collect all the data in a lake, database, and then act and work from data that's being held by that third party or directly by the public authority. I think this type of response is probably premature because there's a lot of uncertainty on what is the best way to actually build trust on the data and audit capacity into the data. And probably at this moment, what seems to be at least a useful first step is to think about regulating the competitive access of APIs. And finding an audit mechanism to ensure that that's carried out. There's a second question, which is how much of that data has to be specified in detail, and how much of it can be specified in terms of what is the functional outcome that should come from that data sharing. And this isn't settled either, but generally, according to the OECD principles on regulation, functional specification is preferable to very specific objective function definition for data types. And finally, there is this question of how do you link two different types of entities, so an mobility operator and a public transport operator that is obligating under public service obligations within one data sharing framework. This is unsettled, but there are ways to do this with specific access and specific architectures for APIs. And finally, I'll close by a bit of MaaS storytelling. So this is the feeling that I get when I look at the conversation around what do we need to have in place as a MaaS model. And the MaaS model, if you will, the final model, is the story. But there are a few things that we need to have to be able to tell that story. And I think we're getting perhaps a bit ahead of, putting the cart a bit ahead of the course in this instance. I'll use the analogy of a book. We need words, of course. These are shared definitions. We need phrases. We need a common or compatible syntax. And we need a coherent framework, the page or even the binding of the book, before we get there. I'll touch on these three things quite briefly because they're all three under development in the mobility as a service ecosystem. There are no shared definitions that are common across all mobility as a service players in terms of very simple things like, is a service available? When did it not become available? When does a fair charge start? These kind of things are being developed in silos on the public transport side, in this case, on the micromobility side. And without that shared definition, it's very hard to think about moving forward on some of these other issues. In terms of common and compatible syntaxes, there are a real mix of syntaxes, those that are specific to public transport, NetX, Siri, a number of these that are developed both in Europe and outside of Europe that relate specifically to scheduled public transport services. And these are not best suited for the real mix of services that we're looking at within the mobility as a service ecosystem. There are emerging API frameworks. The TOMP API is developed within the Netherlands and their national pilots, the MaaS Alliance API. There are a number of APIs structures that allow the inclusion of traditional and non-traditional mobility players in a common API framework. And then there's the emergence of new types of APIs that are not specifically looking at the business-to-business aspect of coordinating mobility as a service services, but really trying to find a way in which public authorities can gather information about services that they're responsible for regulating or in spaces that they're responsible for regulating and push out in machine-readable form the rules that relate to how these services should operate. I'll point out this one, the mobility data specification. It is one that's becoming increasingly popular, mainly because it does have that bidirectional flow of information from operators to authorities, and that's in the agency and provider API subfamilies on the left, and the policy API, which allows public authorities to say, this is the, for example, level of subsidy that should be applied to this trip. These are the rules we're playing. These are the rules that relate to when a trip or where a trip can stop for any given type of vehicle or service. And finally, the coherent framework. That is emerging. It's emerging in a number of national frameworks. In Finland, the revision of their traffic code, the Loi d'orientation des mobilités in France, and as I said, in the EU with the multimodal travel information services regulation, which looks to standardize traffic and travel data for all mobility providers and provide a national access point to access that data. This framework, the most comprehensive framework that we have, does not address open booking and payment, although that is in the books for a future edition of that rule. So there you have it. This is the data environment in which mobility as a service is evolving. There are probably more questions than there are answers, but as in any endeavor, asking the right questions first is probably the first step to getting sensible answers going forward. Thank you.